Welcome to this first lesson on proportions. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be learning about the proportional rules that we need to follow in order to create a strong foundation for our manga style illustrations. Now, what are proportions? Proportions really refer to the size, the spacing, and the location of elements in our pieces. So if you think about the eyes, the position of the nose and the mouth, the placement of the head, the size of the head in relation to the size of the torso. These are the proportions. In a sense, you can think of them as the hidden stylistic rules for the size and the spacing and the location of the elements. Now, proportions themselves are extremely critical. They are the secret to pretty much all the styles. If you want to draw in an American comic book style, there are some proportional trends that you will see in that type of work. Similarly, for Disney styled work, you will see certain proportional styled trends, and the same goes for manga. Now, of course, manga has many sub-styles and differentiating features from one manga artist to another, from one anime series to another. And so what we need to keep in mind is that these proportional rules are really guidelines. They're just a basis for us to work off of, but they're a solid basis and they allow us to iterate and expand and grow our own stylization from these guidelines. Last but not least, and very important, is I want you to remember that you need to really strive to learn these proportional rules off by heart, right? Learn the rules off by heart. And the reason for that is that once you learn these proportional rules off by heart, you're able to very easily and quickly draw multiple manga characters without having to spend a great deal of time going back to a proportional guide, trying to say, oh, okay, let me draw this here. Oh, I need to measure this thing here. When you have it in your mind, it makes drawing much easier, and it's pretty much essential if you want to get work done in a reasonable space of time. So learn the rules off by heart. Okay, let's jump straight into the proportional rules, and we're going to work from top to bottom on each of these proportional guides. Now, in front of us, we've got two different sets of proportions. Both of them are worked out using the head size, and so we refer to the first one as 7 heads and the second one as 8 heads. The head itself is used while you're drawing, that you'll use your thumb and your forefinger or your middle finger to measure out the head of the character you've drawn, and then copy those measurements down the rest of the figure as you're drawing in the rest of the body. And that's pretty much how we start measuring out the proportions. So let's start with the one on the left. It's a 7 heads proportioned, feminine looking body, but this particular proportional system can be used for young males and females, and it is pretty much the most common type of proportions for manga, your 7 heads proportions. Now, generally speaking, when you have older characters or more muscular characters, more strong characters, you'll be using the 8 heads proportions on the right. This is also called idealistic proportions, and it's also used in comic book style work. Now, manga proportions do vary between the subgenres, so depending on the genre that you're moving toward, you'll want to use one or both of these systems as you're drawing your manga characters. But far and away the most common is the 7 head system, so let's start there. Our first head over here, it defines the head height itself. And from this head height, we start getting multiple points of reference and measurements. So as we move down to the bottom of the second head over here, you can see that we're able to now define a location of the nipples, which is about a third of the second head. And this is our nipple line. And the nipple line is pretty important as a measurement tool. We don't measure at the bottom of the second head for the breasts, because that would then limit us to the size of the breast we might put in a female character, or the size of the pecs we might put in a male character. We want the nipple line, which will help us to correctly position where the nipple should be, and then we can establish the breast size from there, whether they're bigger or smaller breasts and so on. Moving down to the bottom of the third head, we get the crotch line. And the crotch line helps us define the V shape that lets us kind of indicate where we are placing the crotch. Now, it's an approximate location. These are guidelines. You can put the crotch directly on the line. You can put it a little bit lower. You can even put it a little bit higher. It depends, right? And it depends really on what you're going for and the body style you're going for. But typically, the crotch line is around the bottom of the third head. And in addition to that, the navel line or the belly button line is around halfway of the third head. So let's put that in, navel line. And you can see here the navel of the belly button is just a little bit above the line. It can go in this area, in this region. You can put it a little bit lower as well. And then just slightly below the second head, around a third into the third head, is the rib cage line. All right. Now, don't get panicked when you kind of seeing all these lines and all these sort of splits and divisions. It seems more complex than it is really. Once you learn the measurements, it's very quick to iterate on this. And thus, I will reinforce once again, really strive to learn this stuff off by heart. And you kind of, once you know it off by heart, you kind of just forget it and you just keep using it. And it's kind of very automatic. And so the rib cage line over here helps us define the bottom sort of V shapes of the rib cage, and at the same time helps us kind of figure out a good location to put in our elbows. You can see our elbow line is kind of just below the second head, maybe just above that sort of third of the rib cage line here. So our elbows are very similar in location to the rib cage, bottom of the rib cage. All right, this can vary obviously based on the character you're drawing, but this is the general zone and the general guideline. All right, now just taking a look at the arm length, the upper arm and the lower arm. The lower arm itself up to the hand usually extends to somewhere on the thigh, somewhere in the middle of the thigh. So this kind of region is where you'll want the hands to be. And it's very similar as well on the 8 heads guide here. All right. Then halfway through the 5th head, we have the knee line. And this, of course, defines where we're putting our knees. And then lastly, the bottom of the 7th head, we have the foot line. And this shows us where to extend our lower legs to. Something to keep in mind, which is quite important, is to make sure that the upper legs are a little bit shorter and the longer legs, the lower legs, mind you, are a little bit longer. And this gives the character a more of a manga-like look. When you take a look at a lot of manga and anime characters, they tend to have slightly exaggerated leg lengths, and this is where it's from in terms of the 7 heads model. Most of the time, we're fitting in the head up to the crotch in just 3 heads, and the remaining head length is for the legs. All right. So they can actually just say here torso and head, and here we can say legs. All right, so that's pretty important to remember, and which is substantially different in a sense in the 8 heads model. All right, now looking at the shoulder width is really defined by having 1/3 of the space of the head on each side of it. This is for a female character. For a male character, you can extend this on the 7 heads model to about a half on each side, if not a little bit more. Just keep in mind that you feel that the proportions look reasonably appealing or acceptable to you, not too crazy, unless crazy is what you're going for. So it's 1/3 of space on either side of the head on the female model, and we do about a half for male. All right. Looking at this once again, this 7 heads model, keep in mind that this is the most common type of proportional measurement for male or female, even though we've got a female figure drawn here. And a little bit later on in the lesson, I'll explain to you how to masculinize or feminize your lines, and some key differences between male and female when we're drawing out the figure, right? But the proportions really stay the same. Let's move on to the 8 heads proportions here. Once again, more of the masculine build characters, strong characters, older male characters. It's not to say you can't use this for strong female characters as well. Starting at the top, we have the headline, and that defines the top of the head to the bottom of the chin. The bottom of the second head defines our nipple line. And once again, the nipples fall roughly in this region. It also allows us to kind of figure out where the bottom of the pecs are. Bottom of the third head helps us to find the navel line. You can place that in there. And you can see roughly halfway between this third head, we have the bottom of the rib cage, which is our rib line. And that, in this instance, shows us the location of our forearm and rear upper arm split. So we can see the joint here halfway through that line. And then that brings us down to the length, which, as I mentioned previously, goes to around the middle of the thigh. And then the bottom of the fourth head is the crotch line. The bottom of the middle of the sixth head here is the knee line. And then last but not least, the bottom of the eighth head is the foot line. All right. Now, the width of the shoulders in a male form, particularly in the 8 heads, is an entire head's space. And that gives you a good amount of space for a masculine build. And now that we've done that, it's important to actually take a look at the key differentiating factor between a male build and a female build. And really what this is that in males tend to have broader shoulders and narrower hips. This is a bit of an exaggeration, this symbolism, but it's good for remembering. And females have the exact opposite. They have narrower shoulders and they have broader hips. And the reason for this, let's take a look at these two characters. The reason for this is that the pelvis of the female is wide, and the reason it's wide is so that it can accommodate childbirth, right? So it's there to accommodate childbirth. And you can see on these models here, we have the female with the smaller shoulders and the wider hips, and the male with the wider shoulders and the smaller hips. And to take a quick look at the pelvic structure, effectively, the pelvis itself in a female is wide. So this is the pelvis, very rough version of it. It's pretty wide across. And what happens is the great trochanter, which is at the top of the femur bone, which is at the top of the leg bone, I will draw here, it's the upper leg bone, comes down like this. The femur comes down and the great trochanter comes out of the pelvic bone like that. And because it's wider, the great trochanter itself pushes the skin out further, and so women have broader hips for that reason. That's the femur over there. But in males, the actual pelvis itself is more narrow, something like that. So it's narrow horizontally and taller vertically. All right. Once again, proportions are critical. They're our anchor point, our baseline fundamental for the structure of the elements in the figure, the size, the spacing, and the location of the elements. Please put in the time, learn these off by heart. You have these resources as well. In addition, there is a demo of me drawing out these exact proportions that follows this lesson. That is the end of the proportional lesson, and I will see you in the next lesson.